Teresa Deitert will be speaking on utopian democracy.
Okay, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. So this paper is part of my ongoing research for my PhD dissertation. And this paper argues for the post-311 collaborative art practices of Kaihatsu Yoshiaki's The House of Politicians and Tokuyama Bontaru's The Fourth Branch Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, as reflecting and expanding on the desire for the practice of direct democracy. Oops, I don't know why this, okay. This desire fueled the heady but short-lived rise of the Japanese anti-nuclear movement in the immediate aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear disaster of March 2011. Kaihatsu's and Tokuyama's artworks are part of the creative practices that came to the fore anew as part of the post-Fukushima anti-nuclear movement. Moreover, these practices were also, as sociologist Mori Yoshitaka has pointed out, a continuation of creative strategies of the anti-war movement of the early 2000s. Both works contest the distribution of hegemonic power of the Japanese government. I'm sorry, I don't know why my presentation is moving automatically. Oops. I don't know. Well, can I stop it somehow?
Try holding the cursor in the corner, the left bottom corner, and then you'll see the commands.
Okay. Both works contest the distribution of hegemonic power of the Japanese government in post-311 Japan by creating utopian spaces of exchange where the voices of the otherwise silenced could be heard and agency was redistributed. To examine House of Politicians and Fourth Branch political efficacy, it is helpful to consider Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony. This concept acknowledges the state's maintenance of control, not just through physical force and cohesion, but through the masses' consent achieved through popularization and dissemination of the hegemon's worldview and ideas through civil and cultural institutions and the mass media. Post-311, the Japanese government sought to preserve the status quo by controlling cultural production and mainstream media to diminish oppositional opinions. In this context, this paper explores the works of Tokuyama and Kaihatsu as alternative cultural texts conceived independently of government and institutional funding. Against an environment of censorship where post-311 anti-nuclear protests were largely ignored by the Japanese mainstream media, the artist's works challenge cultural hegemony and produce models for more inclusive democracies that can be shared by humans and non-humans. While Tokuyama and Kaihatsu refrain from openly categorizing their work as activism, this paper argues that their artworks, despite subtleness, carry political efficacy in highlighting power dynamics, challenging invisibility of activists, disaster victims, and non-humans. Through this, the artworks bring about pivotal mental changes in artists, collaborators, and the viewer participants of the works. Hence, Tokuyama and Kaihatsu's artistic collaborations can function in a way that political means that might be perceived as too confrontational would not be able to do. This claim is underscored by employing an ecological approach based on Bruno Latour's actor network theory, which argues against the nature-culture divide in lieu thereof acknowledging interconnected agencies of humans and non-humans. This paper considers the artists, their collaborators, and artworks as part of translocal networks where the agency of the artwork can be foregrounded and traced beyond the artist's outspoken intentions and control. Oops. From May 2016, Tokuyama began visiting the anti-nuclear occupied tent, Tento Hiroba, regularly to experience the daily life and struggle of its occupants. Through conversations, Tokuyama learned about their hardship of keeping watch 24/7 in a tent without proper insulation, running water, toilets, or stable electricity. Initially cautious, through sharing simple everyday rituals, such as drinking alcohol or tea, and having meals together, Tokuyama and the occupants started to warm up and form a common understanding of each other's situation. On September 11, 2011, around 1,300 people had gathered to build a human chain surrounding the Tokyo Diet building in protest against nuclear power. Spontaneously, tent representative Fujigami Taro and his collaborators decided to stay even after everyone disbanded and built a tent in the vacant public space, a so-called pocket park, in front of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. With their occupation that preceded Occupy Wall Street, who utilized the same protesting strategy 6 days later on the other side of the globe, Fujigami and co. initiated a visible challenge to governmental power at the heart of Tokyo's government district. In the following years, a legal battle between the tent occupants and the METI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, ensued, wherein the occupants upheld that the removal of the tents would constitute a violation of the freedom of expression. 5 years after the start of the occupation in 2016, Tokuyama's intervention came at a time when the optimistic atmosphere of the first years after the post-Fukushima anti-nuclear movement had subsided, and the tent occupants' sense of being able to achieve a difference was giving way to resignation, existing side by side with stubborn persistence in the face of sudden eviction and financial ruin due to impending governmental fines. Thus, Tokuyama intervened in a situation where the voices of the activists were being harshly silenced by hegemonic state power, and out of the two possible outcomes, one, the success of the activists, and two, the silencing by the government, the latter seemed a lot more likely. Within this deadlocked situation, Tokuyama's collaboration with the occupants envisioned a third possible outcome, playful but compassionately picking up on the occupants' struggles while highlighting unequal distributions of power between government and citizens. To visit Fourth Branch in the Anti-Nuclear Tent Museum of Tento Hiroba in June 2016, the visitor had to enter, squeezing themselves past a stack of folding chairs into a jumbled, dim-lit space. They were greeted by a small model of the 3 tents of the occupation site. The tops of the models were left partially open so that the visitor, assuming a godlike view, could locate themselves standing inside one of these tents. Also on display was a contract written by Fujigami in which he formally assigned the property of the occupation site to Tokuyama, as well as a board with mock-up real estate information of the Fourth Branch. On a low folding table stood the centerpiece of the display, a little model of the Fourth Branch building. The model took the shape of an unassuming rectangular building, but in bright pink and adorned with colorful prints of the occupants' protest banners. Tokuyama created the building's design following the occupants' wishes. For instance, the artists and occupants decided on the inclusion of welfare facilities into the design of the Fourth Branch, such as the equipment with a free cafe for the disadvantaged of society, or the possibility of exchanging labor for food. This conceptualization foregrounded the social nature of Fourth Branch as a utopian space of redistributed hegemonic power. Within this space, the activists would be on equal footing with the METI by imagining the occupation as a permanent building of the ministry. While this integration presupposes that their conflict will remain perpetually unresolved, it imagines the two parties as equals. In Tokuyama's work, collaboration preceded and decisively influenced how the project took shape. In contrast, Kaihatsu Yoshiaki identifies the development of his concept of House of Politicians as a one-person's idea. With the incentive to confront politicians with the reality of evacuated nuclear ghost towns and the contaminated Fukushima environment, Kaihatsu constructed the hut for House of Politicians just around 400 meters outside of the exclusion zone at Haramachi, Minamisoma City. There, the radioactive contamination was 0.4 microsieverts per hour at the time, which is 8 times higher than the usual background radiation. Kaihatsu set the opening of House of Politicians for the 15th of March 2012, a year after the last of 3 hydrogen explosions at the Daiichi that had catapulted massive amounts of radioactive particles into the environment. Kaihatsu sent almost 700 letters to politicians to invite them to stay at the hut. Wishing for the betterment of Japan's nuclear energy policy, the letter asked the politicians to experience the situation in Fukushima, the thoughts of the locals, and a quiet solo stay at the hut to think about the pros and cons of nuclear power. Thus, rather than confrontation, Kaihatsu sought to open up a democratic space for communication and deliberation. Art director Ikeda Osamu has called Kaihatsu a one-person democracy. Ikeda notes that while one person and democracy seem to contradict each other, Kaihatsu's artistic practice could be termed as such, as Ikeda defines democracy as, quote, the chain reaction where one person's specific action causes other people to act, unquote. Ikeda sees Kaihatsu's work as opening spaces for collaboration. While Kaihatsu retains primary authorship of his work, his practice defined as one-person democracy can be seen as a catalyst aiming to congregate multiple agencies to decisively impact society. Subsequently, neither artist's work exists in isolation, but is constitutive of networks of diverse agencies not under full artistic control. Kaihatsu aimed to specifically address politicians outside of Fukushima, as he felt a lot of decisions related to Fukushima were being made by politicians in Tokyo who had never been to the area. It was this spatial gap of visibility and access to information that the artist sought to close through fostering collaborations. However, in the end, no politicians came. Kaihatsu admits never expecting them to do so. Instead, he wanted to incite a sense of guilt in them for being absent, thus leading them to change their actions as politicians. As such, House of Politicians does not only consist of the physical installation, but is also constituted by this conceptual framework of an unanswered call to participate and a failure to summon politicians to collaborate. The work's efficacy then lies in the highlighting of failure of this collaboration to come to fruition. In this way, the work revealed distributions of hegemonic power, uncovering the constitution of Japan's democracy as a sham, where the voices of the participants of this political system remain unheard. The hut itself is made of a simple plywood structure, a narrow rectangular box-shaped room. It is installed on a vacant overgrown lot next to a rural road and opposite a few uninhabitable contaminated houses just outside of the exclusion zone. A large rectangular plywood sign facing the street proclaims it to be the House of Politicians. Made from unworked panels, the hut's insides are empty except for 2 chairs and a clock frozen in time to Tuesday the 15th, 6:14 a.m., the time and date of the 3rd hydrogen explosion. The 2 chairs, one of them a children's chair, face a window at the wall opposite of the entrance and oriented towards the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, 20 kilometers away. Kaihatsu chose this axial layout to symbolize that the nuclear disaster had irrecoverably altered the relationship between adults and children, which could no longer be described without the nuclear power plant. Anyone who would take a seat in the adult's chair would not be able to avoid considering the position of the child's chair in their line of sight of the Fukushima landscape. The framing of the landscape by the single window contributes to a heightened perception of it, whereby the relationships to others, especially children, must inevitably be acknowledged when taking a seat there. Even in the absence of a child, the chair invokes its presence, exerting agency as a proxy for the weakest members of society. Therefore, the setup of the hut's interior aims at the redistribution of power, whereby these victims of contamination, children and non-humans, as represented by the view of the Fukushima environment, are cast out of invisibility and make their presence felt. This space represents a utopian space that challenges Japan's current state of democracy. In this space, agency is redistributed and politicians can no longer ignore their responsibilities towards humans and non-humans made to suffer from radioactive contamination. To discern the efficacy of the works, it is decisive to closely consider their surroundings. The tents and their protest paraphernalia, such as banners and signs, as well as the environmental surroundings of House of Politicians, are charged with the meaning and effects of human and non-human actors and interconnected with the networks of protest and nuclear sites locally and globally. It is therefore crucial to emphasize that Fourth Branch and House of Politicians were interventions not into the neutral white walls of exhibition spaces, but the everyday reality of activists, Fukushima residents, and the environment. The interplay of peripheral space, including its humans and non-humans, and the works affect the viewer participants' experience. This generating of experience and mental occupation constitute the work's political efficacy. Part of the installation of Fourth Branch was a video work documenting the various activities which Tokoyama had engaged in with the tent occupants throughout the months leading up to the exhibition held in June. He intended to show this film together with the installation. However, from the second day of the exhibition, the mobile generator which supplied the tent with electricity broke down, and only the video's audio was being played from rechargeable speakers. The artist nevertheless saw the work as complete, even without the video, as for him the most important aspect of his display at the tent museum was that as many people as possible would come and visit to see the tent for themselves. According to Tokoyama, visitors to the Fourth Branch mostly were not involved with the protests and were uninformed about the activists' activities. Subsequently, the exhibition provided a learning experience for the visitors. Tokoyama recalls an encounter with two METI state officials coming to visit Tento Yoruba. Under the pretext of viewing an art exhibition, these officials felt it was acceptable to visit the occupation site. On this occasion, they met and talked to the activists for the first time. One state official confided that while as government officials, they had to propagate the use of nuclear power, as private people, they doubted the legitimacy of it. The artwork does serve to challenge a narrative of unified opinion to support hegemonic power upheld by the ministry as an institution. Within the context of the Fourth Branch installation as art, the government officials' status and obligations were bracketed, opening the officials up to the voices of the activists. Kaihatsu's House of Politicians as a project progressed as its timeline became congruent with that of its environment. It continues to exist to this day and evolves through adding processual stages. From April to August 2012, on the 15th of each month, Kaihatsu held participatory events at the hut and its surroundings. Shooting wild plants, taking place on the 15th of May 2012, consisted of picking bamboo shots and plants in a nearby grove. However, instead of eating the plants, Kaihatsu and his participants lined up the plants and took pictures of them. The name of the event was a play on toru, which either translates as to pick and to take a meal or as to take a photograph. Through engagement with the radioactive environment and the symbolic gesture of taking a picture instead of eating the plants, Kaihatsu underscored the irrevocable alteration of the Fukushima everyday. Kaihatsu's activities drew on connections and highlighted the kinship of the locals with their environment, while showing how the disaster turned the Fukushima life world into a dystopia defined by the uncanny, ubiquitous presence of radioactive contamination. To sum up, acknowledging the agency of the space recognizes how the environment makes the work part of itself, complicating a delimitation of where the works end and exterior space begins. For instance, House of Politicians is subjected to geological weathering and radioactive contamination, non-human agencies that are outside of Kaihatsu's artistic control. In Fourth Branch, the tent museum's conspicuous architecture with tarpaulins and iron poles, including walls covered with anti-nuclear art, as well as unforeseen instances, such as the breaking down of the power supply, decisively influenced the visitor's experience of the artwork. In both works, their settings co-constitute the experience of the works, while the works contribute to a heightened perception of their surroundings. Artistic control is further renounced by basing the materiality of the works on collaboration and participation, opening them up to being spaces shared pari passu by the artists, their collaborators, and visitor participants. Through this practice, Tokuyama and Kaihatsu, within the conceptual realms of House of Politicians and Fourth Branch, created spaces for democratic participation of humans and non-humans, where the establishment and failure of collaborations highlighted the distributions of hegemonic power. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.